Okay, so David Brown from Shooters Union Australia, thank you so much for joining us. This is actually the first episode. This is the first long form interview we've done for Gun Owners Radio. We're referring to it as Gun Owners Radio MAGNUM, because rather than the usual one or two segments, this interview is going to go as long as it needs to. So we're looking forward to really getting down deep and talking about how things are in Australia. And I really appreciate you joining us.
Well, that's a privilege to be the first. Put the pressure on.
There you go. All kinds of pressure. So if you could just talk a little bit about what exactly is Shooters Union Australia?
Okay, so 10, 11, 12 years ago, a couple of my colleagues on the board, probably out of frustration, we have a very good association down here that runs lots of great ranges and good hunting programs and lovely glossy magazines, all that sort of thing. And they do a little bit of political lobbying, but it's not their key thing. It's not their core business. And I think out of frustration with the fact that post 96, 97, when all the states were held to ransom by the federal government in implementing these complex and draconian firearm restrictions, it became almost impossible to push them back and even make them sensible. So we were left with a situation where, as the gun ban industry, let's say, the gun ban industry are always trying to march forward, and governments always solve problems by more legislation. So incremental change, nobody notices, but over time it makes things worse. So someone had to at least build a barrier to either stop or slow that down. And Shooters Union was born. Initially it was started here in Queensland, and as it grew, we would now say we're the second biggest shooting organisation in the country. And it was primarily for political lobbying and for, just pushback against the various police departments in all the states with anything stupid, ridiculous or unfair.
It said from your website is very informative, very well laid out. And I think your messaging is fantastic. It says on your website, we exist to support all legitimate users of firearms, whether for sporting, recreational or occupational purposes, by advocating for sensible firearms regulation, the provision of education about firearms, and supporting shooters seeking to vindicate their rights through political and legal processes. Where does the rubber meet the road? What sorts of activities are you guys doing in order to support that?
Well, let's look at the first thing is the representation. So even if you're not a member of Shooters Union, we're representing your interests anyway, by default. So we have membership ranging from farmers, feral pest controllers, competition shooters, dealers, and oddly enough, particularly here in Queensland, what you would call the SWAT team, we call it CERT, the Special Emergency Response Team, half of them are members of Shooters Union. So even though we don't represent them in a professional capacity, because they have an interest obviously in firearms through their work and quite often through hunting or other recreational purposes, we just represent everybody's interests. Doesn't matter whether you're a user or a supplier to the industry. So that probably covers the who we represent. How do we do it? Well, predominantly it's through building relationships with A, the media, and B, political, and when I say political, more so ministerial. So the people that are in government, whether they're conservative or liberals in your language, we have to work with them regardless. So building relationships with them so that when someone comes up with a crazy idea for even something like banning gel blasters or something, which has been attempted, mind you, and that's been in the US media, banning toys, you'd say, well, we're a firearm group, not a toy group, but it has an impact on us. So we go into bat to sort of neutralise the negativity with the various police ministers in whichever state. And we've had a bit of success at that, actually. We've certainly done a good thing here in Queensland. Recently, we've had the story that made the international media about toys was down in Tasmania. And Alistair Shepherd, who's our representative in Tasmania, he, along with the industry groups down there, and he used his good connections within the government. This is where it was really important. He might have been the conduit to actually get better representation for the other groups. So we use those sorts of techniques and tactics to, you know, make a difference. And certainly we're doing that in South Australia at the moment as well.
So you what's your personal background? What do you do for a living, or you know, what brought you into Shooters Union Australia?
Okay, well, let's go right back to when I was 9 or 10 years old. My best mate at school, we were in Scouts together. His father was a Scout leader. He introduced myself and probably quite a few other kids at the time into shooting. You know, started out with air pistols and air rifles, and then later on, my brother and I used to annihilate cane toads. Cane toads were a big plague problem, a bit like feral hogs. So every afternoon after school, we'd go through a tin of 500 air pellets, you know. So shooting started off as a kid with fairly modest beginnings. I did engineering, had an engineering business, industrial automation and control, but I've also had a big exposure in aviation, general aviation. And these days I have a small avionics business. And the aviation link to shooting is sort of important. So kids are growing up, a little bit more disposable income, and about, I'll say, 6 or 7 years ago, started thinking I'd like to get back into shooting. And my wife was really keen on doing clay target shooting. And through an aviation friend who's Tom Gresham from Gun Talk Radio and Gun Talk TV that you would know in the US quite well, Tom got me motivated in the sort of Second Amendment kind of mindset. And as a result of that, I then went looking for someone in Australia that actually had a similar kind of role in terms of Second Amendment activism. So a Second Amendment Foundation, NSSF, NRA, you know, those sorts of organisations. So from that, I went along to a function where we had a Canadian politician who was explaining how they got rid of their firearm registry. And this was a really good dinner function. It was very well attended. And I made the silly mistake of standing up, asking a question, and as a result of that, they identified me as someone they wanted to have on the board of Shooters Union. So,
what was the question?
I think I was asking. Oh, now that's a good question now, but it was something about futility of laws and you know, whatever it was, and. Anyway, I was approached afterwards, and you know, the net result is, even though I was told by my wife you can't go on any more boards because I'd gotten off some aviation industry groups, you know, here I am.
So you weren't really you weren't back into guns. You were barely back into guns as a hobby, and they picked you up and said, "Hey, this guy clearly has the fire in his belly. Let's get him involved."
Yeah, correct. So if I looked at it in date terms, you know, back when in fact, in my early 20s, I didn't have any firearms, but my brother had semi-auto rifles and things, and in fact, both my brothers. And, you know, we used to enjoy having a bit of a shoot in the bush with them. That was all legal back in those days. Yeah, it wasn't until we got involved, you know, with rifle and handgun shooting and clay target shooting that, you know, I started to I'd known Tom through aviation stuff and through listening to his radio program every week. It just motivated me somehow to think, you know, there's got to be someone here doing something like this. And yeah, just happened to be in the place at the wrong time.
I've actually found that that's kind of a common story. People that have been into guns for decades and It's sometimes is harder to get them involved. They've kind of been beaten down, and it's people that maybe are new to it or are coming back into it. You know, I guess they don't know all the bad news yet, so they're kind of motivated, and they think, you know, heck, let's you know, if it's like this, let's change it, let's go move mountains. And some of the best members of our organization and some of the most motivated volunteers that I've seen in the Second Amendment world are really relatively new to gun ownership, and it's so refreshing.
Like this saying that all it takes for the forces of evil to rule the world is for enough good men to do nothing. And I suppose if more and more people followed that, you'd find, because you know what it's like when you're looking for people to do some work on election days or to do things, everyone's yes, want to help. But, you know, when it comes to the crunch, only a few step up. So you've got to go looking for the passionate ones. And, you know, we found a few. I mean, you commented about our website being quite well presented. It did struggle for many years, but a lot of that development work was kicked off by one fellow who was from South Carolina. He'd married an Australian girl, and he had a bit of a marketing and IT background. And he came to us really as exactly the same story. And yeah, so he motivated that change and made a positive impact. Good. So yeah. Small amounts of work done by good quality people gets a lot done.
So why would you, if someone were to ask you, you know, why is this important? Why is gun ownership important? You know, if you really dig down into your soul, why does this matter? Why does it matter to you?
It could be part of this, you know, you're told you can't do this, so therefore you want to kind of thing. And I don't know what it is for individuals across the world. Certainly a lot of Australians don't understand the primary reason in the US, particularly these days, would be that of self-defense as being a primary motivator. Here it's more agricultural use, recreational use. But why is it so important? I think it's part of everyone's culture. I mean, certainly we've been accused. In fact, my colleague Graham Park, who was one of the founders of Shooters Union, along with Jan Lindsley, Graham was on a TV, you know, one of those morning breakfast programs with one of the gun ban industry leaders, and she accused Graham and shooters in general of trying to normalise shooting, and Graham was straight onto it with no, we're trying to re-normalise it. It was normal for hundreds of years. And the gun ban industry has done wonderful things, and particularly in your country with, you know, terms like Saturday night specials and assault weapons and, you know, manufacturing fear and stigmatizing groups and, you know, trying to drive down the view. If you want to change something in society, demonize them. Look what happened to cigarettes. Now, I'm not a smoker, I'm not a fan, and if you're, you know, your listeners like a cigar or whatever, great, fill your boots. But you realize that you were demonized and ostracized in order to, you know, have a significant effect on your population or your demographic. And that's what's happened here and in other parts of the world with I would say, the culture of the shooting sports and or just firearms in general.
What the average Australian, if you go into a grocery store or whatever, and you ask the average Australian what their impression is of Americans, or specifically gun owning Americans, you know, what would they say? What's the stereotype?
Yeah, so that's the answer's tragic. I will tell you that. As Lisa and I have spent, probably in the last 10 years, we've spent at least a whole year in the US. So we spent a lot of time there, a lot of friends there, traveled there many times. and we follow what goes on, particularly in the shooting industry, the number of times I have to pull people up and say, hang on, this is what you've seen from the media. This is what the media in Hollywood have suggested. And it's wrong. And the impression of the average Australian is that Americans carry around ARs and like on a daily basis, they're in there. And look, in some cases it is true. They're in their trucks and what have you. And I think that's fine as long as they're locked up and secure. I would carry one around in a Dodge Ram as well. But the perception is they're walking around and will willy-nilly shoot at anything, right? Whereas I know the exact opposite when I'm in with hundreds of people and we're all got, I don't know, at least 70 rounds of ammo and carrying, and there's not a problem. And you can't tell who's carrying and who's not. That is a complete odds to the perception that the average Australian has. Now, a lot of them that have been to, say, New York and what have you, that's all they've seen. They go to the tourist highlights. I would call them the lowlights, but they don't understand the greater real America. But they think maybe down in the South, it's all gunslinging and dangerous as hell, when it's actually quite the opposite. But the perception created by media and Hollywood is actually very damaging. The average Australian hasn't got a clue, to be honest.
And it's a negative impression, but would you describe it as something they're fearful of or sad about, or what if you were to dig in deeper to that negative impression, how would you describe it?
So the common one is they're sad about it. Those poor Americans, they can't live a free and happy life kind of impression. I think that would be the, and I'm trying to read the minds of others, but they think it must be awful to live with all those guns around you. And I sort of think, well, I was in a gun store 2 days ago, and I'm going to be back there today. They even offered me the Colt room to do this video. And if I was in there, there are probably 1,000, probably one of the world's, maybe the world's best collection of Colt handguns, and some pieces that go back hundreds of years. There's a set of 3 Colt revolvers from Tiffany's, the jewelers, on the wall. I don't think you'll find that anywhere else in the world. So being surrounded by it, it's like this rich history. The average Australian does not get that, and they don't. They just have this view that guns are evil and awful, and guns kill people. Therefore, Americans having probably somewhere now about private ownership of about 500 million firearms, they think it must be something traumatic. So yeah, it's very challenging to try and change that misconception.
Well, it's interesting that in Australia, gun control is a symbol of freedom and happiness, where on our side, gun control is a symbol of tyranny, and oppression. How is it so different? How did that happen in Australia that it's so different? Is it just entirely based on bad movies and poor media?
Partly. Australians are pretty laid back and I would say almost apathetic. If you go back pre-97, there was probably, I'm going to guess, there was probably an extra 500,000 people maybe that were firearm owners by default. In other words, they had a 22 that they used to go rabbit plinking with as a kid, but they still had it. They weren't actively using it, or they had, as often the case, granddad's old 303 from World War II. And as a result, with draconian laws, they either had to become licensed and register that firearm, or they had to turn it in and it got crushed. And a lot of history was destroyed in the process. So as the population has grown over that time, the shooting industry and the population in the shooting community has also grown. In fact, right now, it's growing probably as fast as it's ever grown. But we still only represent something like, I'm going to guess, 7.5%, 8% of the adult population. So if you said there was something in the order of 1 million firearm owners in Australia, previously with a much smaller population, there'd have been 1.5, 2 million, something like that.
Okay, so you mentioned 1997 when a bunch of really bad laws passed. So I want to just kind of set some context for people. In April of '96, there's an area in Tasmania. It's a tourist area that I guess it used to be a prison colony, a former prison colony, and now it's a tourist attraction called Port Arthur. And a deeply, deeply disturbed young man tragically shot and killed 35 people, wounded another 23 people. And when I say disturbed, he is truly disturbed. He has all kinds of mental issues. Even today, while he's still in custody, has mental issues. That incident kicked off a huge legislative anti-gun movement that, for the most part, all passed in '97. Right? Did I pretty much get the broad sweeps right on that?
Within 12 months, everything had changed. It's probably important to note here, though, the backbone of that legislative change had been in existence for, I think, 8 or 9 years. I've got the documents somewhere. They were released from the National Archives a couple of years ago because they were, locked away. But basically, police commissioners and state and federal governments had been meeting over time, looking for ways to implement some, national, that there's state laws. Okay, the states are responsible for the laws, so every state is different, but it was a national agreement. I nickname it the National Firearm Disagreement because none of them are the same. But this framework actually existed prior to, and the gun ban industry existed prior to. So as a knee-jerk reaction, because I think at the time, and I could be wrong, but I think at the time that was the world's biggest public mass murder using a firearm, outside of obviously a war. And it got global media attention. So we had to do something. And on the back of that, society was changed. And I say changed because it appears to us that the gun ban movement and the media were complicit in actually changing the way people viewed firearm ownership. And it's rather ironic that it ties in with a similar push back in the Clinton era. And you could rattle off all the names, the Giffords and all the others in the US. That period of time, you wonder why conspiracy theories are born. I'm not going to start conspiracy theories or talk about them, but you can sort of see why they grow and gather some momentum, because the same sorts of things were happening in the US that led to your Clinton-inspired assault weapon ban of, I think it was 96, 97 or 98, somewhere in that period. Fortunately, that got a sunset period put in it. And here again, I talk about, the constant threat. The constant threat is now, if they ever get an opportunity to do it again, there'll be no sunset period. So you've got to make sure it doesn't happen. But also one other thing I'd like to add to that, people talk about policing and control of firearms. The Colt semi-automatic rifle that Martin Bryant acquired was in the hands of Victoria Police some months prior. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how he came to possess it, but that was never meant to have wound up in a shop, or never, certainly in Tasmania. And if you think you can trust the police and a government organisation to control firearms, there's a clear example of why not. And there's a clear example of someone with some mental health issues who shouldn't have had access. So someone who's, like in your country, that is adjudicated with mental health issues or is a convicted felon, the NICS system should stop that. Well, nothing stopped it here. In fact, you almost got to wonder, no one talks about it, but how the hell did that was handed in or was picked up out of a crime scene or something, whatever it was, Victorian police had it and it should never have made its way into the wrong hands.
Well, one of the points that you just touched on is something that I talk about a lot and have noticed, and that is that the agenda already exists and has existed for a while, but they don't move on that agenda until they have an opportunity. So every time there's some kind of tragedy, it really has nothing to do with the reaction has little or nothing to do with the actual tragedy. It has everything to do with taking advantage of emotion in order to pass an agenda that already exists. And what ends up happening is many anti-gun laws get passed that would have had no impact on whatever tragedy they're taking advantage of. Now I've noticed that they've learned to just take small bites and say, all right, well, we're going to pass this one horrible law rather than a whole menu of laws. But the menu exists. It's sitting in a lobbyist's desk right now, just waiting for the next tragedy. And it sounds like you discovered that. You picked up on that real early.
Discovered it. We've just experienced it only a few years ago. Whether most Americans it would have made the media there, but several years ago, we had a Islamic-inspired terrorist in Sydney go into a cafe with a backpack bomb, a cut-down shotgun, and the incident we're talking about. It was the Lindt Cafe, as in Lindt chocolates. Now, that was actually in a former bank building, so it was very secure in terms of all its glass, but it had a lot of glass, so the world got a good view of everything that went on in that siege. Now, out of the report, and there was lots of failings with the police and the judicial system. I mean, this guy he was out on bail for I don't know whether he was involved in the murder or anyway, he should not have been on the streets, right? And this firearm, in theory, should not have been on the streets. So out of that inquiry came a whole bunch of recommendations. Not one of them applied to lever action firearms. Lever action firearms, mind you. Yet, Australia's biggest firearm importer, dealer, manufacturer, does a lot of military and police around the South Pacific, big business, and is a big optical target for the anti-gun brigade. They brought in a Turkish shotgun that was capable of holding 7 rounds. And in their range, one of Australia's leading shotgun shooters demonstrates this thing, and sure, you can, if you're good, you can get 7 rounds off. Of course, you've got to reload the thing, so that takes you half an hour. But that video was then sped up and used to drive a big anti-gun agenda against these new technology, and you can laugh at that, new technology, lever action's new technology from the 1800s, new technology firearms that are lethal. They're far more lethal than an ordinary shotgun, and they hold a whole massive 7 rounds. So we've got all these restrictions in place where the 7 round ones became only accessible to feral pest controllers who, trust me, use AR-10 and AR-15 and SLR kind of rifles, not lever action shotguns. We got these restrictions in place, and now if I wanted to go and buy one, 5 round capacity. Where's the sense in that? And we wasted, probably collectively, in the fight over a couple of years, the whole industry probably wasted millions of dollars, and the government wasted millions of dollars. It's just laughable.
Ludicrous.
And it all came from the gun ban industry down here, looking for something. Now, on the quiet, don't tell them, but they were trying to get bans on semi-automatic handguns. that were far more restrictive. In fact, actually just banning them even for sporting use. And we're probably fortunate that we lost 2 rounds in lever action shotguns because we didn't lose handguns. So they're always looking for the opportunity, and they'll dance in the blood of victims to further their agenda. So, and that's nothing new. I mean, you guys have the same problem.
Yeah, and in '97 was the year everything really truly changed for Australia. And I want to talk about the specifics, but before we really get down into the kind of the meat and potatoes of the specifics, just broadly talk about what was gun ownership like pre '97. What is gun ownership like post '97?
Okay, so in terms of gun ownership for the typical civilian, we could probably break it down, and just to simplify it, just for simple terms, let's call the occupational firearm ownership. So that's whether they're farmers, feral pest controllers, security guards, whatever. And then there's myself, competitive shooter, likes going hunting, what have you. So in the occupational end of things, semi-automatic rifles, semi-automatic shotguns, pump action shotguns. What else could we add to that? Some cases, handguns. They are available if you've got a business need. So in other words, you're a farmer or you're a feral pest controller. Now, getting away from that, coming to, and most of those firearms, semi-automatic rifles, pump action shotguns, etc., they were everywhere prior to '97. I mean, even in our family. So if we move to the, let's call it the sporting and the non-professional use of firearms, we're pretty much limited to air rifles, bolt action rifles, over-under shotguns, lever action shotguns, 5-round limit, of course. We have a magazine capacity limit of 10 rounds if it's a centerfire rifle, but if it's a 22, no magazine limit. So there's lots of little silly tweaks, but basically I can't just on my current license go out and buy a semi-automatic rifle, whether that be a Ruger 1022 or an AR platform or an old SLR from former military use, which there were plenty of. In fact, I would argue there's still plenty of them out there. We reckon there's probably more than 1 million of them buried, hidden, off the grid, let's call them. So, because we know they weren't all handed in, there was a hell of a lot more than in existence. So, the legal firearms that we have available, pump rifles, which is odd. We can have pump rifles, but not pump shotguns. And we talked before about Hollywood. John Howard, the Prime Minister at the time, was interviewed, and I think it was, I could be wrong, but it was one of the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies where he's using a pump action shotgun.
Yeah, Terminator 2.
Terminator 2, that would probably be the right one if the timing's correct. They've thrust a microphone in front of him and said, but what about weapons like that? And John Howard said, yep, we're going to ban them too. All the bureaucrats in the back room are saying, oh my God, we've got to go and rewrite all these regs now to include pump action shotguns, because they were going to be in the category B, category A, category B kind of firearms that were available to recreational and private individuals. So pump action rifles remained, pump action shotguns went into the harder to obtain, needed a greater use category, all because of Hollywood and a dumb reporter and a dumb Prime Minister, you could argue. So if that paints the picture of what you can and can't have. Now, handguns, some occupational use and some sporting use. But certainly we can't carry them, concealed for personal protection. And in fact, not allowed to have any of these firearms for the purpose of self-protection.
So let's talk about, let's get a little more specific on that. Let's leave aside the professional use. So basically, let's just, if you have some business need, like you're getting rid of varmints or pests or whatever, or if you're doing something where there's a direct need to own a firearm, you can own the firearm, whatever's appropriate for that use, whether it's semi-automatic or pump action, whatever. So that's kind of its own. They kind of created a class of people that are allowed to own firearms. Military and law enforcement, and then there's another class of professionals that can own firearms. And it sounds like they have to go through some red tape and file some paperwork, but generally they can get whatever it is they need in order to do their job. Let's focus on Joe Lunchbox, a guy who wants to own a firearm, and you said that the ability to protect yourself is not acceptable. So that person has to go down a whole other road. Let's say, you decide, hey, I want to own a pistol. What exactly do you have to do? You've made that decision. I want to own a Glock 19, the most popular firearm, in the world, most popular pistol in the world. I think I'm pretty sure it's the most popular. Let's say you want to own, a semi-automatic pistol like a Glock 19, 9mm, nothing exotic, something very normal. What do you have to do?
So you'd have to demonstrate that you had a sporting interest, and sporting interest could be in everything from the sort of like the Olympic disciplines being air and 22 LR calibers. But if you want to use the Glock 19 example, or a 1911 platform for, say, IPSC shooting, that's fine. My wife and I love a bit of IPSC shooting. It's interactive, it's fun. It's a bit like clay target shooting, but using, a handgun. So if you're involved in those sports, you can have those. But the interesting thing, and this applies to the guy with a semi-automatic rifle for feral pest control, it can only be used for that purpose. So he can't go hunting. I can go hunting with my, pick a 308 or a 6.5 out of the safe and go deer hunting, and we do. But if I was a feral pest controller and had an AR-15, I couldn't take that, because I'd be personally hunting, not professionally engaged in a contract. And it gets even sillier in terms of, if you are a farmer and you've got a handgun, let's say a 38 revolver for, dispatching stock in cattle trucks or whatever that get injured, but you also want to do some Western action pistol matches at the shooting range, which is 60 miles down the road, can't use my revolver that I use for primary production. I've actually got to go and buy another one because it's got a different serial number. So now I've got to have two revolvers. So you think the anti-gun brigade would be, concerned about that. As someone who's a firearm enthusiast, I think, hey, it's a mandated need to buy another firearm. But the silliness of it is, you could have one for sporting use and one for occupational use, but don't you dare swap them over, even if they're identical. Don't take the wrong serial number to the range. It's that silly. So yeah, handgun ownership is purely for sporting or for security or professional purposes. Now, understand one thing: police in the US often get provided firearms, but some of them have their own. Here in Australia, if you're a police officer, you wear one all day at work, but the minute you clock off, it is illegal for you to touch a firearm unless you are licensed. So they operate under an exemption because they're at work.
Wow. So if let's say that's your New Year's resolution is you're going to start competitive shooting. Let's say your real motivation is I want to be able to defend myself in my house. So I have to pretend that I'm going to get into, no, that doesn't happen, huh?
You're seeing my face. I'm saying no officially. I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
Having said that, we've also got storage laws, and I'm very much in favour of storage. You don't want kids or people who shouldn't have access to your firearms, no matter what country you're in. When you're not home or you're not in control of it, it should be in a safe. It's funny though, our laws here are such that if you had a paperclip, you could defend yourself with it, or pick up your phone, or an electrical extension lead. If you want to use that as a weapon to help defend yourself, that's okay. If you had a firearm handy and you used it, that's okay. But, and the big but is, you must be able to demonstrate that your life was in jeopardy and that you used reasonable force. So it is not like the US, where you really do have protection from the law almost. A good shoot's a good shoot in the US, and a bad shoot's a bad shoot, and you'll get prosecuted. Here, you'll get prosecuted and you'll have to prove that you actually, did something fair and reasonable at the time. So I think the individual that just says, I'm going to go and get a license just for that purpose, they're probably kidding themselves, particularly if they do get involved in a defensive shooting situation. They'd want to be very, very careful. But, you are excused for using anything under the law if it's available to you. But carrying it around or having it in your possession for whatever reason, purely for the purpose of self-defense, no, that's not a legitimate reason.
So you're saying it's enormously risky to defend yourself with a firearm. It's possible that it's legal, but it's enormously risky. So anybody who says, "Hey, I'm gonna kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, become a competitive shooter so I can defend myself," is putting themselves in an enormous amount of risk, even if they're successful getting the firearm.
Yes, and having said that, though, there was a case a couple of years ago, Dave Dunstan down in right on the border of Victoria and New South Wales. He had, let's just say there was a criminal break-in, broke into another place, broke into his farmhouse in the middle of the night. His wife went and grabbed whichever rifle it was out of the safe. Allegedly, it was unloaded. So I would call that foolish, because all he had was a stick. But grabbed the firearm. This guy yielded, complied, and Mr. Dunstan drove him, in your language, about 30 odd miles into town to the police at 2 o'clock in the morning or something, and handed him over. You would say, hey, job well done, right? Great. He finds himself being prosecuted and firearms collected, and his wife, even though she was also licensed, was told that no firearms in the house under your license. And we're going, even with our laws, that was a bit of a far outreach by the police. Obviously, people like ourselves and a couple of other associations got behind him and badgered the living daylights. And the media, oddly enough, came out on his side. He was acquitted, got his license unsuspended. They didn't take it off him. They didn't cancel his license, but they suspended it. And, he went back to normal. But it just goes to show he did everything right. But he came that close, do something silly. And look, that's probably the same in the States too. You do, I think if you pull a gun on someone in the US somewhere and reasonably the thief runs out the front door and runs down the street and you go and shoot him in the back, you're a murderer, But here you run closer to the chances of at least losing your firearms and getting a criminal record, even if you do things right. So you've got to be it's not something that you would just go and do lightly and falsify why your reason would be your reason. And look, out of all the people I know, and I know hundreds, they might be prepared to use a firearm if they really had to, but, they keep them for sporting purposes or for, agricultural or other uses.
Okay, all right. So let me change that. I'm glad I phrased the question that way because that was a very interesting discussion. But let me rephrase it then. I have a sincere interest in becoming a competitive shooter. I decide that's my New Year's resolution. So January 1, I make that decision. How much paperwork do I have to go through? How much time will it take me to get through it? And what kind of expenses is that going to be? Is it a long wait and it's a rich man's sport, or is it fairly able to attain if you just kind of stick in there, or what's the process like?
So I'll just talk about Queensland, and most states are somewhat similar. Queensland, for example, you'll do some background and character reference checks. You'll get membership to a club. So you'll have, that's a mandatory part of, demonstrating your interest. You'll do a safety course. So firearm safety, is probably not a bad thing anyway, particularly seeing a lot of people don't grow up with them now. You probably need firearm safety courses more now than you did 30 years ago. You will then go through a 6-month period where you'll, once a week or once a month or whatever, go along and start to learn to competitively shoot. And that's obviously a good thing. However, at the end of that 6 months, you then put your license application in and you get given a license. The limitation that's still placed upon you, for the next 12 months, you can own an air pistol and say a 22, or you can own one centre fire, be it a revolver or a semi-automatic, depending on what disciplines you're using. And that's it. You couldn't have all three. Now, if it's a husband and wife, like when Lisa and I first got started on this, we had an air pistol and a 22 and a centerfire, and we were just, we could quite legally use each other's firearms, but you couldn't have, 3 or 4. You couldn't have a revolver and a semi-auto 9mm and a 22 and an air pistol, because that would make you somewhat more dangerous. So there's a little bit of stupidity in there as well. But once you've gone through that 18 months, well then, all you need to do is maintain membership to a club and demonstrate via a logbook, just like a pilot's logbook, that you're attending the range and, at least nominally, let's just call it half a dozen times a year for round numbers. And, and you can get involved in all sorts of disciplines and have as many different things, different kinds of revolvers, different kinds of semi-autos. It's a little bit more realistic in terms of what you can own thereafter. But
so the average person, so like you said, in 97, everything changed, and the average person can't carry concealed. They're very limited as far as what firearms they can own. You can't have normal capacity magazines. You're limited to 10, and it sounds like in lever action, you're limited to 5. It sounds like there's a fairly long timeline in order to own firearms, and you're fairly restricted on where you can go and what you can do with them. And in fact, you said that you have to have specific firearms for specific purposes. And it's been 23 years, almost 24 years. In Australia, has there been a decrease in crime victims as a result of these gun laws?
Well, let's look at some statistics, and I think I know why you're asking this question. If you looked, and I did this myself, probably it was 2017, because it was 20 years after, most of this changed. If you looked at firearm deaths, and we're talking suicides, homicide, the whole spectrum of what people look at in statistical terms, firearm deaths from, say, 96, 97 through to 2017. And if you looked at that, there's a slope that went down at a fairly consistent rate. Immediately after 96, there was a bit of an uptick. I will concede, I'll give the anti-gun brigade, I'll give them some benefit of the doubt. We'll call that an anomaly, but it did actually go up. But generally speaking, the line is pretty consistent all the way. And if you were in the media, you would say those laws worked. John Howard's wonderful gun laws, look at the gun deaths have just gone down consistently every year ever since. Mind you, firearm ownership has been going up. So if you want to be intellectually honest, though, you've got to say, well, compared to what? Well, let's look at the 20 years prior. So I went back and I plotted out and I got this from the federal government's statistical database. Go back 20 years prior, and that same slope from if I do it on the screen here, it was pretty much like this across the screen for a period of 40 years. So you'd have to ask yourself, did those laws really make a difference? And the honest answer is absolutely not. So the curiosity got me of, well, what about somewhere like New Zealand, which is a small country, about the size of Queensland in terms of population. And they've got semi-automatic rifles, shotguns. Oddly enough, and Americans will hate to know this, but if you buy a semi-automatic or a bolt-action rifle in New Zealand to go hunting, it is frowned upon if you don't buy the optional suppressor.
Wow.
It's almost considered mandatory, right? So we look at New Zealand's data for the same 40 years, 20 years before and after the changes in Australia. And if we use a HB pencil, that line almost looks identical. And I thought, well, okay, let's pick another one, Canada, another member of the Commonwealth and larger population, closer to North America, well, is in North America, closer to the United States, same kind of result, the bit of deviation along the way, but the general slope has been somewhat consistent for 40 years. I thought, okay, those crazy redneck Americans that are shooting the living daylights out of each other, it can't be anything like this. And you go and get the data, there's plenty of FBI data. Put the pencil line on the page, and now I have trouble telling which line's which. So what does that tell you? That tells you that firearm safety in the US, criminal use even of firearms, has halved in the last 20 years in the US. I mean, and gun ownership has gone up in all of these jurisdictions. So what it tells you is legislation has done nothing. Nothing. In fact, if you believe it does, you have to believe in miracles and that John Howard's gun laws were retrospective and they worked in 3 other countries, including the USA, in which case the guy is a genius. So intellectually, no. I mean, that's really the end of the argument. Gun laws and gun ownership have no effect. And I always believe in the theory or the policy of educate, not regulate. If you want to improve firearm safety, educate. And if you look at what the NSSF have been doing, the NRA has been doing here in Australia, organisations like Shooters Union and SSAA and others, it's all been about education. The internet has been a wonderful thing in terms of, like, you could probably, YouTube, one of the anti-gun institutes of the internet, has actually done more for gun safety because people like us have been promoting firearm safety. So that's where the real gains have come from, not at all from regulation.
So when all this happened, when the regulation kicked in '97 and people had to make a decision and act, how easily did they give up the firearms? I think there's kind of this romantic idea that, they'll that I hear from some gun owners that, they'll never give it up. You'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. And, we've seen in other countries what happens when gun restrictions become extremely restrictive. What was it like? What was the attitude? How easily did they give up guns?
Just rough numbers off the top of my head, say 600,000 firearms were destroyed. And a lot of those were granddad's, they were family heirlooms. Probably, and I'm guessing, 250 odd thousand were semi-auto rifles, shotguns, pump action shotguns. And we know because of what limited records, because there weren't many records kept, but the importers themselves knew how many they'd brought in over the 20, 30 years prior, let alone, World War II type firearms. There were millions more. And you would say that the average Australian, probably like the average American or anyone else, is just going to say, look, my family, my job, my everything else, it's not worth risking getting caught with this and going to prison and then not having access to firearms at all or whatever. And if they can't change it, they've got to go with it. Really, most people just want to get on with their life. They don't want to be forever looking over their shoulder. And I think even in the US, that would happen. There'd be a small element, however, that would fight to, literally to their own death. And if the government comes knocking, pretty sure they're going to outgun you one way or the other, sooner or later. You will lose. They may lose too, but they won't lose as much. And, if people that want to run that argument of out of my cold dead hands, well, yeah, that may well be how it'll end up. But guess what? You're going to have to be pretty good to take them out, and there's going to be a lot more of them. So I don't see that as being that is not a very desirable situation to end up in. What you've got to do is beat it with government, you've got to beat it with your voting, and you've got to beat it in court so that you don't end up in that situation. Now, here in Australia, it was rushed through. The government had a complete mandate, and the federal government literally blackmailed states. We will withhold your health funding if you do not implement these laws. Because understanding in our case, just like the US, states are sort of sovereign entities. So it was bribery, it was blackmail. You've got to stop that. Well, here we had no way of stopping it, and we certainly didn't have a constitution and a Second Amendment that protected our rights. And people in Australia don't understand this. A lot of Americans don't understand this. The Second Amendment doesn't grant you a right. The Second Amendment says to government, hands off, you're not allowed to touch this right. We never had that. And if you let the Second Amendment, it might still remain, but if you let government and the courts basically treat it in such a way that it becomes irrelevant, once it becomes irrelevant, you'll never get it back. So, that's a warning from down here. You can't let that go.
That's an excellent warning. Non-compliance is a enormously horrible and losing strategy. They talk about an ounce of prevention and a pound of cure. If non-compliance is your strategy, and I'm of course not talking to you directly, David, but if a person's strategy is non-compliance, they need about 500 pounds of cure. They need 1,000 pounds of cure. They're so far beyond the 8 ball. And I'm glad there are organizations like yours in Australia that have formed in order to give people meaningful ways to get things changed. And I'm really impressed with your organization very much. What's been the biggest victory for gun owners in the last 20 years in Australia?
Probably, if you look at pushback, very little. The framework is so well entrenched, and as a percentage, we represent this much of the population, sort of 7.5%, 8% of the adult population. And the media are so strong that it takes a lot of work. We will eventually get suppressors, and slowly suppressors have been becoming more approved for feral pest control type operations. Eventually, I think one day we'll get suppressors being an optional thing for, hunters. Certainly, New Zealand is a classic case. But we haven't gotten there yet. So that shows you just how hard something as common sense and non-harmful as that is to get changed. And yet suppressors are not written into the National Firearm Agreement, which is, interesting to note. What's the greatest successes? We've certainly stopped a lot of stupid stuff and more restrictions. We would have semi-auto handgun limitations. We'd have worse magazine restrictions. over the years, there have been lots of things that have been stopped or minimised. Look at the lever action thing. I mean, they just wanted to ban all lever action shotguns, and they would have all moved into the category of occupational use only. We probably wouldn't have any semi-automatic handgun competitions by now. So we've stopped a lot of those things. In some states, we've had wins on small things. One here in Queensland, we have registration, which is, again, another folly. We could probably spend an hour on that because the registries are completely inaccurate and they're dangerous. But you can now take your bolt action 223. Let's say I've got a Ruger 223 and I decide I want a Kimber or a Lithgow or something else. I take it into Cleaver's Firearms down here in Brisbane and say, righto, I want that one. All they do is process the paperwork, swap like for like. That, oddly enough, has been a great thing. You think about farmers that have a rifle or a shotgun that goes down for whatever reason, usually because it's been abused in an agricultural environment, straight into the gun shop, swap it over. They don't need to wait a week or two for some police officer to say, oh, he wants to swap a like-for-like firearm. We need to approve this. It's just the dealer does it, paperwork's processed, job done. So things like that. We've pushed back on some silly ammunition laws and what have you. So I'd like to sit here and say, hey, we've now got ARs approved for sporting purposes like 3-gun competitions. One day it might happen, but it's going to take a long while, and it needs the political opportunity to exist. You've got to get someone with the willingness to take the punt that the sporting shooters are not going to become a problem because they get semi-automatic rifles for 3-gun competitions. And it's the old story of why would I risk my political career doing that if it went wrong? The media will crucify me. So that's the kind of problem you're up against.
So how many, when people do run for office at whatever level, how much of a discussion is there about pushing back on the gun control laws or strengthening gun controls? How big an issue is it in Australia when people run for office?
It is slowly becoming a bigger issue, certainly in some states. Tasmania, let's just say the Conservative government down there actually took a plan to the last election. They won the last election, and then the media slaughtered them over changes to gun laws. And then we didn't get all the things that we wanted, but we still now have better dialogue with the current police ministers down there. Here in Queensland, we have a Liberalist government and have had for a few years. We work reasonably well with the current police minister, and right now there's some fairly embarrassing stuff going on with, again, the folly of firearm registries and all this sort of stuff. And they've been quite nice to us. They also know that we've cost them a lot of money, and we've done some things at electoral levels that have, they give us a little bit more attention than they otherwise would. We are also fortunate to have a few MPs in Parliament here in Queensland that are very, very pro-gun. One of them's a feral pest controller and a dealer. The other two, and these people are from rural communities, are very much pro-gun. In fact, the cartoonists in the media, if there were people with coronavirus coming across the border into Queensland, they had a picture of Robbie Catter saying, with a shotgun saying, it's like rabbit season sort of thing, So politically and in the media, they are recognised as being pro-gun. So, and we've got a few in the federal Senate. There's a lady down there that is, often the media photographs of Bridget McKenzie. You could Google her. You'll see her with a shotgun over her shoulder. So it's changing, but we need about 200 years worth of change in the next 5, I think. So here again, the lesson to your viewers is don't let the genie out of the bottle. You end up like us, it will take you a couple of 100 years. It won't be in my lifetime, I don't think.
Well, one of the things, our organization has been, we've actually partnered with especially Firearms Policy Coalition, which is a national organization, and we've become plaintiffs in a very good group, love them to death. And we've become plaintiffs in a couple different lawsuits, but that wasn't really our goal. That wasn't what we started or why we exist. We really wanted to focus on activism because I feel that gun owners, especially in California, have put too many eggs in the judicial basket. They've, you know, if something bad comes along, they just kind of throw their hands up and say, all right, well, let's sue them. But the reality is sometimes lawsuits need to happen. And if they go the right way, they're extremely effective. How is it in Australia? Have there been lawsuits? Is that an option, or paint the picture for us?
So part of the problem we have, being a small number, the amount of money and the cost of running lawsuits, you know, that divide is probably a little worse than it is in the US, because you've got a lot more gun owners willing to tip in some money. It does work, I must say. We have had some wins with supporting a few individuals here. Usually they're farmers. So farmers in Australia are like, they're a protected species. You know, we joke about Australia grew off the sheep's back. These days it's probably more mining, and agriculture's not the biggest, but certainly agriculture's a big sector of society and a big contributor to our economy. So therefore farmers get a little more sympathy in the media, and as a result, they get a little bit more sympathy in the courts. So we have been pursuing things like suppressors and other things with the agricultural industry. I think that's the only way. And well, it's not the only way. Politically is the best way, because then you get regulatory change and you don't have to fight it in the court. But sometimes that's the best way to go about it. And certainly for people in California, you've got some regulations there that are more stupid than some of ours.
I don't think we're very far off from Australia. I think that's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you more at length, David, in this interview, is I don't think people in California truly realize just how close we are to Australia. And like you said, in some ways, we're worse.
In some ways. You could say there's a few thousand miles, but it's just all water. Take the water away and you're a next door neighbor. Yeah. If you look at, you know, if you look at the unconstitutional restrictions that have been going on in California over a long period of time, I mean, just the handgun roster for a start, we could probably buy things here that you can't. Now, we do have your 10-round magazine limit problem, but there's certainly handguns here that you can buy in Australia you can't buy in California because they're not on your roster. Your most recent stupid one was to do with ammunition. Background check for every ammunition sale. Now, admittedly here, we need to be a licensed holder and we can buy ammunition. But that's it. You know, there's no NICS check, or, you know, we're background checked once when we get a license and then we're allowed to buy ammunition thereafter. So yeah, you guys have got, you know, some benefits, but as I understand it, there's a lot of California where if you want a concealed carry permit, you've got to pay off a county sheriff or a judge or someone to even get a look in. And, you know, that's unconstitutional. Shouldn't have to ask.
Well, I agree with you there. We definitely agree there. Like on a lot of things. Last thing I wanted to talk about.
Could I just add something to that?
Sure, please do.
Think about this. You guys are, I think, and I might be wrong, but the biggest firearm market in the US is
California is the largest firearms market in the US.
Yeah. So be that as it is, and maybe some of the others are not too far behind, but that's still a significant chunk. What goes on in California has a flow-on effect to the rest of the US, but it also has an effect to us. So whilst we have some Australian manufacture of rifles here, and they make some really nice rifles, and then you've got the Czechs and Austrians and a few others that make some particularly nice handguns. The thin end of the wedge to all of us, and I look at this a little bit selfishly, is that, in fact, if I think about it, just about everything in our safe comes out of the USA, except for Beretta. Our Beretta shotguns come out of Italy. If you guys lose the war on this, if you guys get the Protection of Lawful Commerce Act, I just can't get the correct wording, but you know, the one that protects firearm manufacturers from sued for criminal misuse. You can still sue them for defective product, whatever, but for criminal misuse. If that ever gets up, and the Senate elections in Georgia right now, or coming up, could be the difference in that being repealed, that will have a flow-on effect to even us here in Australia. So manufacturers in the US, they'll be driven out of business. And, you know, the rest of the world probably couldn't survive on Lithgow rifles and CZ and Glock pistols and Beretta shotguns. So, you know, and then for your sake, you wouldn't be able to import them because those companies aren't going to set up in the US and import them either. So it would have a devastating effect on the entire industry around the world. And you can be sure that Biden, Harris, and that crazy guy out of Texas that wants to take all your, I don't want to mention his name, he doesn't need any airplay, that wants to take all your ARs and AKs, you know, you need to have a firewall between yourselves and those guys, because it wouldn't take much. You know, one lawsuit that they win, and you know, your insurance for a firearm manufacturer is going to be off the table, and then all the firearm manufacturers say, well, we're going to go and make paper clips instead.
It's fascinating, David, how familiar with, I'll be honest with you, I'm very unfamiliar with Australia's government and you know, the way you guys are set up, and I'm certainly unfamiliar with your laws. It's fascinating to me how familiar you are with American laws and civics. You know, that you've talked about the Second Amendment, that you've talked about you know, specific politicians. I think you know more about California gun laws than a lot of Californian gun owners. It's really fascinating. I honestly, it maybe sounds a little naive, but I didn't realize just how much of an effect it was worldwide. It feels like it's right here in my backyard. It doesn't. I didn't realize just how global it is.
We've got a few friends in the South, and one particular bunch of friends, we have this joke about the world news, and the world news is literally the US news. And, you know, we've been in a store somewhere and there's been a map of the USA, and I'll name her, Sonia. Sonia says, hey, look, there's a map of the world. You know, and it's very interesting that because the US has so much of everything, the American people tend not to look outside the US as much as, say, Australians who travel the rest of the world. And it takes a long time to get there. We're more aware of Europe and we're more aware of the US. So that could be partly responsible for that. But I think you can blame one of your fellow broadcasting entities, Tom Gresham, for my awareness. It's because we're interested, and those of us that are active in protecting the firearm industry and rights here in Australia, we all share information amongst ourselves, because really we do rely, it's a bit like Australia relies on, say, Singapore for fuel. I mean, we do some refining here, and we manufacture a lot of ammo. In fact, a lot of the powder that goes into your ammunition actually comes from Australia. You depend a lot on us for some of your, or for a fair chunk of your propellant. So we're a player, but we're not the big player. And the big player is the United States. So our interest in what goes on there and how it affects us is far more significant than, you know, if if the powder supplier here, which is part of the Talus Group, Australian Defence Industries, and they supply powder to a lot of your big brand names in the US, particularly all the temperature stable product. If that disappeared, well, they'd be a bit desperate for a while, but they'd find other ways to solve that problem. Whereas if the US industry disappeared, we'd be in a lot of strife. I mean, no one's producing projectiles here that I'm aware of, apart from lead competition projectiles, certainly not hunting and pest elimination bullets like Sierra, Hornady, etc. So we're far more dependent on that, I think, and that's what drives us in the industry to be more cognizant of what's going on in the US and why what happens in the US matters not just to us, but to you, and that you guys need to learn a lesson of what not to do, which was allow laws. And California's a classic example. You know, you're almost as bad as us. You can't let that disease spread across the rest of the US. And I can tell you the likes of Bloomberg and Soros and co, Bloomberg's spending millions. He's spending money like you and I would buy a beer. You know, we go out for dinner and we buy a couple of beers. He puts a couple of $1 million down for an advertising campaign for a Senate seat somewhere. For him, it's nothing. I mean, the guy is.
It really is amazing how badly our side gets outspent. We're constantly clamoring for money, and it seems like the other side, just has endless deep pockets. It's really, really amazing.
Well, in the fight against that, and I'm going to make a plea to your viewers, and this is a challenge to everyone that's watching this, not just yourself, but all your shooting buddies. The upcoming Senate elections, there's 2 Senate seats in Georgia, and this is for all the marbles, right? This is for all the marbles. Those 2 seats in Georgia, if you live anywhere else, donate to Vote Red. It's votered.org, I think it is. Michael, you looked it up earlier when we were
talking about it. It's voteredamerica.org is the website you were referencing.
Yeah. So, or anyone that's doing some political activism with these upcoming elections in Georgia, those 2 seats, if the Senate flips, they'll have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Welcome to Australia is what I'm going to predict. Welcome to lawful commerce and arms laws being repealed. Welcome to all sorts of things. So it is for all the marbles. And again, I'm going to be selfish. It's, we're one of those marbles over here. Get behind getting the Republicans. I don't care if you hate Republicans. I don't care if you hate Donald Trump. This is about your gun rights. Once you lose them, you'll just remember Australia. So if you're watching this and you're not doing something, if you're in Georgia, make sure you're doing something. If you're outside of Georgia, make sure you're donating. This is for all the marbles.
When for those listening, when David and I spoke before the interview, he said that the election in Georgia to him was the most important thing in the Second Amendment world right now. The most important thing in the Second Amendment world right now to an Australian who's fighting for the rights of gun owners is the Senate election in Georgia. I thought that was amazing. And
absolutely. It's
voteredamerica.org. You got that from Tom, you said? Is that?
Yeah, Tom. If any of your listeners also listen to Tom's program, he's been bashing on about that for about the last 6 weeks. Steve Scalise was on his program last week. Now, I should be careful. I think he's from Louisiana. Is that correct?
I can't remember. I know he's a congressman, and Steve was actually one of the people that was. He's actually a victim of. He was shot.
Absolutely.
He was shot by some crazy. lunatic, but yeah, he's a leader in the Republican Party in Congress, very outspoken on Second Amendment issues.
And he was articulating how critical this is. And again, I got to say to everybody, you need to do something or you're going to lose. He was articulating very carefully how things would change if the Democrats get those 2 seats. Ultimately, Kamala Harris will have the final say, and you've only got to go to the Biden website and look at gun control and what it is that they're promising. It'll be coming to a state near you. So Georgia is the last line of defense. I mean, it'll be game over. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. It'll be game over if those 2 seats go the wrong way.
Steve Scalise is in the House of Representatives, and he represents Louisiana's 1st District. He's been in Congress since 2008. So again, the website that you recommend is voteredamerica.org. David, I really appreciate your time. I was fascinated. I just am so impressed by what you guys are doing in Australia. I think it was refreshing and eye-opening. I think it's also a little scary, and shows it's a horrible example of how bad it could get. And I really appreciate you fighting the fight.
Well, the little bit we do down here is not insignificant in our context. Certainly, if that is of motivation to your listeners to get active, if you do nothing, it's going to get worse. If people say that I'm not into politics, are you a gun owner? You're into politics. End of story. It's there. You can't avoid it. So get active, get behind your NRAs, get behind the Second Amendment foundations, your local gun groups like the Cal Guns, and you could probably name a whole heap more depending on which state you're in. But, get behind these organisations that are actually doing something. I mean, these days, for less than a cost of a box of ammo, like $100, in fact, can you buy a box of ammo for $100? Throw $100 at each one of these people. Do it once a month. Do it once a year. Do something. Take your buddies to the range. Do whatever. Just get active.
Exactly right, David. And if you aren't quite sure, contact us. We run San Diego County Gun Owners. We're more than happy to help you get involved. We're specialized in activism, but we do so much more than that. But David, thank you so much. What's your website for Shooters Union Australia?
It's shootersunion.com.au. We'll happily take some American dollar donations. They'll get turned into South Pacific pesos. And, Australian dollars are, much appreciated. So shootersunion.com.au. But right now, donate. You can't lose Georgia. So don't worry about us for a minute. But that's our website. I would like to also make a shout out to Kevin and a couple of other guys from the San Diego area. We met them at Gunsight. My wife and I have trained at Gunsight a few times, and we were having a bit of banter. They listened to your program last week, probably because I tipped them off. And anyway, a couple of good Marine, I think retired Marines. I might be wrong whether they're still active or not, but good gun loving and San Diegans. So
nice.
G'day, Kevin. Keep up the good work.
Nice. Well, excellent, Kevin. Well, I'd love to have Kevin at one of our San Diego County Gun Owners meetings or events. So excellent.
You want to get him on the show in his tactic kilt.
Oh, nice. He's got a tactic kilt.
Yes. Fine legs he has, not.
Excellent. Well, David, thank you very much. Very much appreciate your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.